November. Spanish influenza, which had swept across Europe and the eastern states, hit Brailsford Junction late in October, killing more of our citizens than died in the war. The schools were closed, and people scurried along the half-deserted streets wearing eerie-looking masks of white gauze. At least one person in four was dangerously ill, with twice that number less seriously affected. Sometimes the disease struck with swift fatality. One ancient couple on the northern edge of town struggled out to their well to get a pail of water. The old man died at the pump, and his wife collapsed beside him, the handle of the bucket still grasped in her stiffening fingers. Mine was one of the milder cases, but on this occasion my father seemed concerned. He bundled me in several sweaters and blankets and helped me into the car. I begged to take Rascal with me, and he consented. We drove slowly through the increasingly leafless countryside toward the old North homestead, now operated by my father's brother Fred and his gentle wife Lillian. I was to be placed in the care of Aunt Lily, who never refused a sick child or an orphaned lamb. It had not occurred to my father to telephone her. He, like my Uncle Fred, merely took her for granted. She had been an attractive young schoolteacher when my Uncle Fred had come courting in the late 1890s in a dashing rig behind a prancing team. And she still had traces of her former beauty after bearing 3 sons, cooking, washing, cleaning, and mending, gathering eggs, and churning butter throughout these many years. She said that when she died, she wanted to come back to the farm and do it all over again, because this was her idea of heaven. My Uncle Fred was of a coarser grain, but Aunt Lily loved him. Strong, sun-browned, and strong, and rough, and weighing a well-proportioned 200 pounds, his jocosity was tinged with cruelty. He delighted in teasing Aunt Lily by playing, on his Edison talking machine, a cylinder record entitled Why I Picked a Lemon in the Garden of Love, where they say only peaches grow. I'm going to have to try to find that song. Aunt Lily would sigh a trifle sadly and go on with her ceaseless labor while my uncle chuckled, immensely pleased with himself and his wit. However, no one worked harder or longer hours than my Uncle Fred. With 52 cows to milk by hand, 200 hogs to feed, 40 acres of tobacco to set, hoe, cultivate, top, sucker, harvest, strip, and bundle, and 120 additional acres of hay, corn, and oats to plant and harvest, there were not enough daylight hours during the summer to do the work. Uncle Fred drove his 3 teenage sons as hard as he drove himself, and if he ever gave it a thought, he must have felt his wife's work was easier than his own. His hobbies at various times included photography and taxidermy, and the raising of canaries and goldfish in commercial quantities, the breeding of merino sheep, Shetland ponies, ferrets, Belgian hares, and fancy pigeons. He bought and repaired threshing machines, and he loved nothing so much as butchering day, an agony to the uncomplaining Aunt Lily, as lambs that she had bottle-fed, calves and pigs that she had nursed went to the knife. Somehow, despite all this, it was a happy marriage, and the great old farmhouse offered a warm rural welcome. Aunt Lily came to greet us, wiping her hands on her apron in that perpetual gesture of humbleness which seemed to afflict whole generations of farm wives, who gave so much to so many in return for so little. "Oh, it's Willard and Sterling! Why, Sterling, are you sick?" "Just a touch of the influenza, Lillian," said my father. "I thought that perhaps—" "Why, of course, Willard. He needs my care. We'll put him up in the bedroom next to ours, off the parlor. It won't be a bit of trouble. Come in for a cup of coffee and a second breakfast." We went into the pleasant, fragrant kitchen, with its great range dominating the middle of the room, its long table always spread with a clean gingham cloth, plants blooming at the windows, rifles and shotguns stacked in the corner. From the range, she brought a huge granite-ware coffee pot and poured steaming coffee into thick ironware cups. "Now I can fix you ham and eggs, or bacon and eggs, in just a moment," Aunt Lily said. "And toast, of course. It isn't store bread, just some I baked." I looked up at my father, hoping that he would say something adequate, but he didn't. So I tried to be gracious. "Your bread is the best I ever ate," I said. "And we don't need ham and eggs, Aunt Lily. And thank you for everything." "Why, bless you," Aunt Lily said happily. "You're always welcome. You and your little raccoon, too. You're like a fourth son to me, Sterling." I think that, for just a moment, I think that for just a moment my father was aware of the imposition upon Aunt Lily, perhaps even remembering my mother and how she bore all four of us, Theo, Jessica, Herschel, and myself, while he was conveniently absent. But all he said was, "Just toast and coffee, Lillian. I hope Sterling won't be a burden for a couple of weeks." "I know Fred will be sorry to miss you," Aunt Lily said, bringing the toast and preserves. "He and Charles are shooting squirrels down on the old Coomling place. Wilfred is repairing a threshing machine, and Ernest is upstairs studying his school books. He'll be down in a little while." I sipped the good coffee, munched the wonderful toast, and thought that in this world there must be few human beings as Aunt Lily. For several days I spent most of my time in bed, arising occasionally for tea and toast, or a short walk with Rascal. In the evening, however, I donned bathrobe and slippers to listen to Aunt Lily reading to the family in the parlor. The big base burner with its glowing coals sent ruddy light toward the dim corners where well-worn red velvet chairs and couches and an ornate parlor organ lent touches of faded elegance. Aunt Lily sat in her rocker beside a small table lamp, where the kerosene threw its pale radiance upon the pages of farm magazines. We sprawled around in comfort, listening to her gentle voice as she read an endless serial. Rascal had absolutely no interest in this story, but he was fascinated by the jungle of beasts and birds inhabiting this room. Safely above the floor level, cardinals, scarlet tanagers, indigo buntings, and two of the last passenger pigeons ever seen in Wisconsin perched in perpetual silence on varnished branches amid wax foliage and flowers. Grouped on the floor, eyes gleaming with reflected light, were many four-footed creatures Uncle Fred had shot, skinned, and stuffed in lifelike poses. Badgers and woodchucks, a fox kit, and a ferocious timber wolf made one unlikely grouping under a curve under the stairway. Rascal moved among potential enemies, alert and cautious. He was particularly intrigued by a mother raccoon and her offspring, arranged on the bole of a wild cherry tree. During a pause between chapters of the story, my uncle observed that raccoons are very interesting animals. "Mighty good eating, too. Looks like you're fatting Rascal up to make a coon dinner." "Now, Fred," Aunt Lily admonished mildly, "Sterling loves his little raccoon." "Who taught you how to stuff animals, Uncle Fred?" I asked, hoping to change the subject. "Thurl Coomling," my uncle said, a note of respect in his voice. "A great old fellow, Coomling. Knew taxidermy from A to Z. Only trouble was, he'd draw a bee on a bird he wanted, and then lower his gun. Too tender-hearted." "He was fond of birds," Aunt Lily said. "He couldn't bear to kill them." "I could kill birds all day," my uncle said. "Used to shoot down passenger pigeons by the bushel barrel." "And they're all gone now," Aunt Lily reminded him. "Not one passenger pigeon left in North America." "Let's get on with the story, Lillian." Contrite for having been so bold, Aunt Lily again began her tired voice, column after column of small print, hard to decipher by light. Outside, an autumn wind was slowly rising, moaning in the corners of the house. One by one, Charlie, Wilfred, and Ernest had fallen asleep. And finally, Uncle Fred. Rascal had come to curl in my lap. Aunt Lily's voice faltered, and then was still. The coals in the base burner glowed less brightly now, and the eyes of the silent animals, watching from the shadows, dimmed in the outer gloom. The kerosene lamp still held its pool of light over Aunt Lily's graceful head. In a moment now we would be off to bed, Rascal and mine's warm and inviting, my cousin's less so in the frigid rooms above. Another November night had dropped its curtain on southern Wisconsin. On the 5th morning of my visit, Rascal and I joined the family at 4 a.m. for first breakfast. Aunt Lily, of course, had been the earliest to arise, building a fire in the kitchen range with dry wood which Ernest had already laid for her in the wood box. Uncle Fred arose next. His method of waking his sons was to strip back all the covers in those freezing rooms, shouting joyfully, "Milking time! Rise and shine!" We gathered in the kitchen for a light meal of ham and eggs, hot muffins, and coffee served by lamplight, which gleamed upon the black windows. Charles, the oldest of the boys, was always a little sullen in the morning, but he roused himself enough to tickle Rascal's belly, trying to make him fight. Wilfred was soft-spoken and gracious. He fed my raccoon bits of ham from his own plate and promised to give him a fast ride on his motorcycle. Ernest performed a strange service for any male in that household. He helped his mother put breakfast on the table and suggested that she sit down to eat with the rest of us. Aunt Lily gave him a grateful look, but said she would eat later. While we consumed her country breakfast, my aunt busied herself lighting the lanterns we would need. Among her many chores was the daily task of keeping the lamps and lanterns brightly polished and filled with kerosene. Her 4 menfolk arose without a word of thanks, put on old hunting caps, plaid jackets, and cowhide boots. Each took a lantern and a shining milk pail. I was as warmly bundled as the others as we plunged into the outer darkness, lowering our heads to fight the blustery wind. My uncle led the line. Rascal and I brought up the rear. The swinging lanterns hollowed out the dark, throwing our shadows grotesquely against the barn and straw stack which loomed mountainous and forbidding just ahead. Inside the barn we were swallowed by the beamed cavern, inhabited by rows upon rows of drowsy animals. These stables were well cleaned and freshly limed each day. They had an odor that will always be nostalgic to me, faintly acrid of course, but mingled too with the fragrance of clover hay, the sour tang of silage, the astringent dust of lime, and the warm, good smell of the cows themselves. Hanging their lanterns on convenient pegs, my uncle and my cousins took hay forks and distributed the morning feeding to the cows. Then, sitting on 3-legged milk stools, with their milk pails firmly clasped between their knees, they began descending rhythmic and ringing streams of milk into buckets. It is a soul-satisfying sound, soothing to the cows and the milkers. The bells soften, and the music deepens as the pail fills. Again, it was fortunate that I had Rascal on his leash, for as we walked the feed lane ahead of the animals, a few old cows were cantankerous, hooking their horns and bellowing at him. The barn cats were a trifle suspicious. But when Rascal learned their trick, sitting up just as they did and opening his mouth to get his share of a milk being squirted their way, they accepted him as a veritable equal. Each milker had 13 cows to milk. A long, long process. Rascal and I soon went to sleep on a pile of fresh hay beneath the hay chute. When we awoke, it was to the cheerful boom of Uncle Fred's voice. "Come on, boy! Come on, coon! Milking's done! Time for second breakfast!" As I grew stronger, I helped with all the minor chores, such as gathering eggs and feeding the calves and swilling the pigs. The autumn litters were becoming plump, vociferous porkers with greedy appetites. Under a huge iron kettle near the pig yard, Ernest and I built a crackling fire. Into the kettle we dumped 40 or 50 gallons of fresh buttermilk, to which we added ground feed, stirring the supplement into the liquid as it heated. When the mixture became warm, we dipped it out, pouring it into the long feed troughs. This produced such a wild scramble among the squealing, struggling, slurping beasts that Rascal climbed a nearby apple tree and refused to come down until the pigs had cleaned the troughs and were grunting drowsily in satiated contentment. Rascal liked the lambs, the big workhorses, and most of the other animals, but he never did learn to love pigs. My small part of the farm duties left me with plenty of time for pure pleasure. With Rascal on his leash, we visited the haylofts, filled almost to the eaves with clover and alfalfa hay. Here there were always the sound of pigeons cooing, sparrows bickering, and mice rustling. Such a solemn music that we sometimes fell asleep, cupped in a hollow of the hay, safe from the wind and cold. The grain bins, filled with wheat and oats, invited a dangerous leap into deep waters. But since on one occasion I had been barely rescued from smothering in wheat, I now restrained my raccoon, who was unaware of this danger. In the tobacco sheds, the leaves were brittle and brown. They held no fascination for Rascal, who preferred the hams and sides of bacon hanging in the smokehouse, the cream and fresh churned butter in the spring house, and particularly the top delight of the entire farm, as far as this little bear was concerned, the honey in the honey house. It was Aunt Lily who thought of this special treat. She put on an old gray sweater, neatly mended at the elbows, threw a shawl over her head, and led us through the bee yard to the little brick building where honey was extracted. Inside this efficient room was a big metal drum containing revolving racks which threw the honey through the combs with centrifugal force. The extractor was not in operation at the moment, but enough liquid honey was in the bottom of the drum to fill several mason jars. It ran slowly because of the cold temperatures. However, the golden stream filled one jar after another as we waited, the net result of tens of thousands of journeys by the bees bringing nectar from clover fields all over the countryside. "Now it's time for you and Rascal to have your honey," Aunt Lily said, handing me a clean spoon. Rascal and I shared the spoon, of course, having been messmates on many other occasions. But I didn't get my share of the honey because Rascal had found his favorite delicacy since sweet corn. Aunt Lily did not laugh very often, but she was laughing now until she had to wipe her eyes on the corner of her apron. The wildly excited raccoon had found the dripping honey faucet and was upside down, doing his best to get every drop left in the drum. "Oh, Sterling, what a charming little animal!" She put an arm around me as we watched, and I suddenly had an overwhelming desire to tell her how much she meant to me. I think she knew without words, because when I looked up she was not laughing, only smiling tenderly. We took the mason jars of honey and, leading a very reluctant raccoon, headed back to the farmhouse through the bright and frosty morning. False Armistice Day and my 12th birthday fell on the same date. Aunt Lily answered 3 long rings on the party line, which meant a general message for all phones. It was during second breakfast, and we were at the table. Even before she hung up the receiver, she was saying, "Oh, how wonderful! Oh, thank our Heavenly Father! It's over! It's all over! They've stopped all that terrible killing in France." "You mean the war's really over, Lillian?" Uncle Fred asked. "All over. They're signing an armistice." I couldn't have asked for a better birthday present than this, even if everyone had forgotten it was my birthday. I wanted to be alone to think about it. So I went with Rascal to the pony stable, and we sat for a time on a bale of straw looking at Nellie, her mate Teddy, and their twin colts Pansy and Pancho Villa. So the war was actually over at last, and that nightmare had come to an end. Herschel would return from France, and we could go fishing together. The realization came slowly, then with a rush, and I was jubilantly happy. I picked up my raccoon and danced him around, while he cocked his head and chirred a question. "Let's have a pony ride, Rascal!" Of all these ponies, Teddy was my favorite, a little black devil of a stallion with more tricks than a trained seal. No one had taught him these wicked, joyous quirks and eccentricities. They were built into his nature along with the winds and storms of the Shetland Islands, a throwback to some wild ancestor centuries before his time. He nipped the flanks of cows when we were driving them home from pasture. He backed into tethered teams, kicking and squealing until he sometimes started a runaway. He was a veritable bucking bronco on occasion, rearing and whinnying his defiance to the whole world. He had a very tough mouth, and none of these pony bridles had a curb. I had learned to ride him, however, and was seldom thrown unless he resorted to his mischievous trick of running under certain limbs of trees which he knew were high enough to clear him, but not high enough to clear the rider. It was always a contest with Teddy, and you could gain his respect only by winning, whereupon he would reward you with a smooth, fast ride, his mane streaming in the wind. However, Teddy was demonstrating at this very moment that he didn't like Rascal, and I wasn't risking the life of my raccoon on such a violent mount. The twin colts were far too young to ride, and of course, untrained. This left only Nellie, a broad and comfortable little mare who was as tolerant of Teddy as my Aunt Lily was of Uncle Fred. Nellie took us aboard with no fuss whatsoever, as though she had spent her life carrying the double load of boy and his raccoon. Rascal sat ahead of me as he had on the wooden ponies of the merry-go-round. We trotted down the lane to the pasture, passing still pools where spear points of ice extended over the black depths, and groves of hickory trees where I had already gathered more than a bushel of nuts. We came at last to the solitude of Cumleen's woods and ambled along its winding paths. There could be no better place to contemplate peace on earth than in this forest, where the old naturalist had lived his quiet life. That evening, Aunt Lily cooked a very special feast, not because it was my birthday, not even because of the rumored armistice, but because my father was driving out for dinner, after which he was taking me home. There was roast turkey with hickory nut dressing, a special recipe of her own. There were mashed potatoes and sweet potatoes, and baked Hubbard squash, and more relishes and preserves than I can now remember. Finally, we had a choice of cold pumpkin pie with whipped cream, or hot mince pie fresh from the oven. It didn't seem to matter now that everyone had forgotten my birthday. But of course, it was Aunt Lily who thought of it. "Why, Sterling," she said remorsefully, putting her hand to her mouth, "it's your 12th birthday, and not one of us remembered. And I didn't even bake a cake." Then everybody sang "Happy Birthday," and I felt well rewarded. My father didn't apologize, but he reached into his pocket and brought forth his own personal watch, with its chain finely braided from my mother's chestnut hair. For several generations that old watch has passed from father to son, and may the tradition long continue. On the morning of November 11th, 1918, the real armistice was signed in a railroad car in France. Although men were killed up to the final hour, the ceasefire came at last, and a sudden silence fell over the batteries and trenches and graveyards of Europe. The world was now safe for democracy. Tyranny had been vanquished forever. The war to end all wars had been won, and there would never be another conflict. Or so we believed in that far-off and innocent time. In Brailsford Junction, the celebration began early. The decorated fire engines and automobiles and horse-drawn conveyances crowded the streets in a noisy, happy parade. I interwove the spokes of my bicycle wheels with red, white, and blue crepe paper ribbons. With Rascal in the basket, I pedaled through the throng, ringing my bell as a small contribution to the joyous pandemonium. At 11 o'clock, the fire whistle and all the church and school bells in town joined the chorus. During the afternoon, my elation slowly subsided, and I began oiling my muskrat traps for the season ahead. Rascal was always interested in whatever I was doing, but when he came to sniff and feel the traps, a terrible thought slowed my fingers. Putting my traps aside, I opened one of the catalogs sent to trappers by the St. Louis fur buyers. There, in full color, on the very first page, was a handsome raccoon, his paw caught in a powerful trap. How could anyone mutilate the sensitive, questing hands of an animal like Rascal? I picked up my raccoon and I hugged him in a passion of remorse. I burned my fur catalogs in the furnace and hung my traps in the loft of the barn, never to use them again. Men had stopped killing other men in France that day, and on that day I signed a permanent peace treaty with the animals and the birds. It is, perhaps, the only peace treaty that has ever been kept.